I found an old broadcast tape marked "Do Not Air Again." I want to be clear about something before I begin. I am not writing this because I think anyone can help me. I am not writing this because I believe it will change what has already started. I am writing this because documentation is the only response I have left that feels rational. And rationality is the one thing I am trying very hard to hold on to. My name is Martin Ellicott. I am 41 years old. For the past 6 years, I have worked as a media preservation technician at the Hargrove Lyman Public Broadcasting Archive in Calvary, Maryland. The archive is housed in the basement and sub-basement levels of what used to be the main broadcast facility for WCLV Channel 7, a regional public television affiliate that operated from 1968 until its quiet decommissioning in 2003. The station was folded into the Maryland Public Television Network, and its physical infrastructure was donated to the county, which eventually partnered with the State Historical Commission to convert the space into a media archive. My job, broadly speaking, is to catalog, assess, and digitize the thousands of hours of broadcast material that accumulated over WCLV's 35-year run. This includes everything from local news segments and community programming to pledge drive footage, test patterns, raw B-roll, and unremarkable hours of syndicated filler. Most of it is exactly as uninteresting as it sounds. I spend my days in a climate-controlled room surrounded by shelving units filled with U-matic cassettes, 2-inch quad reels, Betacam SP tapes, and an ever-growing collection of VHS dubs that were made in the 80s and 90s as working copies. The work is methodical. I pull a tape from the shelf, log its physical condition, thread it into the appropriate playback machine, capture the output to a digital workstation, and generate a metadata entry for the institutional database. On a productive day, I can process between 4 and 6 tapes, depending on length and condition. On a slow day, when the oxide is flaking or the tracking is shot, I might spend the entire afternoon on a single cassette. I have done this over 2,000 times. I mention this to make it clear that I am not someone who is easily unsettled by old media. I have seen every kind of artifact, glitch, dropout, and playback error that magnetic tape can produce. I have watched color bars bleed into dead air. I have heard audio tracks degrade into what sounds like breathing or whispering, but is simply the mechanical noise of a worn head drum reading deteriorated signal. I know what tape does when it ages. I know what it looks like when it fails. What I found on March 11th was not tape failure. The sub-basement storage room. We call it the cage because the shelving units are enclosed in chain-link partitions with padlock gates. Contains the oldest and least processed material in the archive. Most of the tapes down there have not been touched since they were shelved, some as far back as the early 70s. The climate control in the cage is adequate, but not optimal. Humidity tends to creep up in the summer months. A few years ago, we had a minor mold issue that required remediation on about 40 reels. Since then, the sub-basement has been lower priority, and my supervisor, Diane Kessler, has generally directed my attention to the more accessible collections on the main basement level. But in early March, Diane asked me to begin a preliminary survey of the cage inventory to support a grant application. The State Historical Commission was offering funding for preservation of at-risk broadcast materials, and we needed an accurate count of what we had and what condition it was in. I was not being asked to process or digitize anything, just to open each gate, visually inspect the tapes, and log them by format, date range, and condition grade. It was straightforward work, the kind of thing I could do with a clipboard and a flashlight. I started on March 9th. The cage is organized loosely by date. The nearest shelving units to the entrance contain material from the late 90s and the station's final years. As you move deeper in, the dates regress. The far wall, about 60 feet from the door, holds the earliest material. The 2-inch quad reels from the station's launch period, 1968 to roughly 1974. I worked methodically from front to back, moving 1 section per day. By the afternoon of March 11th, I had reached the mid-80s section, which was dominated by U-matic and early Betacam cassettes. The tapes here were in mixed condition. Some had clean labels with typed catalog information. Others were hand-labeled in marker or grease pencil. A few had no labels at all, just adhesive residue where a sticker had once been. I was logging a shelf of U-matic tapes dated 1983, to 1985 when I found it. It was a standard U-matic cassette, the large format, housed in a black plastic case. The case was clean, cleaner than most of the surrounding items, as if it had been handled more recently or stored with more care. The label on the spine was typewritten, which was consistent with the station's labeling practices in that era. It read, WCLV-IV-O 713/E Awar BS-REL November 4th, 83/Master. Below this, in smaller type, ORIG Air November 4th, 1983, 2200 Eastern Standard Time. And below that in red ink, someone had written by hand in neat capital letters, "Do not air again." The red ink was not marker. It was ballpoint pen, pressed hard enough that the letters were slightly embossed into the label. Someone had written this with deliberate pressure, the way you write when you want something to be permanent. I picked up the cassette and turned it over. On the back of the case, a second label had been affixed. This one, a standard WCLV archive sticker with fields for content description, duration, and technical notes. The content description read, BS Compliance Relay. Test originated FEMA Region 3 Ref Broadcast, AUAuth 1-83-0041. The duration was listed as 0 hours, 8 minutes, 30 seconds. The technical notes field was blank except for a single handwritten entry in the same red ink. See Program Director / Do Not Duplicate / Do Not Re-Air. I want to explain why this caught my attention more than it might seem to warrant. EBS stands for the Emergency Broadcast System, the predecessor to the current Emergency Alert System. From 1963 until 1997, the EBS was the primary mechanism by which the federal government could commandeer broadcast airwaves to deliver emergency messages. Stations were required to participate in periodic tests of the system, which involved receiving a test signal from FEMA or a designated relay station, rebroadcasting it, and logging the event for FCC compliance. This was routine. Every station did it. The test followed a rigid format: attention tones, a scripted announcement, a pause, and a closing statement. They were brief, formulaic, and boring. I had already encountered several EBS test recordings in the archive, and none of them had been flagged in any unusual way. They were simply logged, shelved, and forgotten. So finding one that someone had taken the time to mark with 2 separate handwritten warnings in red ink was, at minimum, an anomaly worth noting. I finished my survey of that section, returned upstairs, and entered my notes into the database. I mentioned the tape to Diane in passing, describing it as an EBS test cassette with unusual restriction markings. She looked at the catalog number I had logged and checked it against the old card index we keep in the office. A set of metal filing drawers containing the original paper records from the station's operational years. She found the card for WCLV-WB-0713. It was a standard catalog card, pre-printed with the station's formatting. The fields were filled in by typewriter, matching the information on the tape label. EBS Compliance Relay, November 4th, 1983, 8 minutes, 30 seconds, originated FEMA Region 3. But someone had drawn a single horizontal line through the entire card in red ink, left to right, and written at the bottom, pulled from rotation. Permanent. A UTH. GS Diane didn't recognize the initials. Neither did I at first until she pulled the station's personnel directory from 1983 and found that GS most likely referred to Gerald Stassen, who had been WCLV's program director from 1979 to 1991. Stassen was dead. He had passed in 2014, according to a brief obituary Diane found in the county paper's digital archive. There was no one left at the institution who had worked at WCLV during its operational years. The current staff, including Diane and myself, had all been hired by the archive after the station closed. Diane told me to flag it for the grant inventory and move on. She was not particularly interested. EBS tapes are among the least compelling materials we handle. I agreed and I did move on, and I finished my survey of the cage over the following 2 days without finding anything else that warranted a second look. But I kept thinking about the tape. Not obsessively, not with any premonition of dread. I simply could not assign a satisfying explanation to the markings. An EBS test is a standardized recording. It is generated externally and rebroadcast locally. The content is dictated by federal protocol. There is no editorial discretion involved, no creative component, no local variation that might produce something objectionable or embarrassing. There is no reason to pull one from rotation because they were never in rotation to begin with. They aired once during the scheduled test window, and that was it. So what did it mean to write "Do Not Air Again" on something that was never going to air again anyway? And why would the program director personally authorize its restriction? On March 15th, I went back down to the cage and retrieved the tape. I brought it to my workstation, which is equipped with a JVCCR8250 U-matic player that I maintain specifically for this format. I inspected the cassette before loading it. The tape pack looked good. No visible signs of warping, mold, or cinching. The oxide coating appeared intact through the cassette window. I threaded it into the player, connected the output to my capture workstation, and pressed play. The first thing I saw was color bars. Standard SMPTE pattern, clean, well-calibrated. The bars held for approximately 15 seconds, which was normal for a broadcast origination tape. Then the screen cut to black for 2 seconds, and the EBS header appeared. It was the familiar format, a static card, white text on a dark background, reading, "This is a test of the emergency broadcast system." The card was accompanied by the standard dual-tone attention signal. The 853 Hz and 960 Hz tones that anyone who watched television in that era will remember as a single, grating, discordant sound. The tones held for approximately 22 seconds. I noted the time on my workstation's capture log. Everything so far was completely standard. After the tones, the screen cut to a second card. This one read, "The following message is transmitted at the request of the Federal Emergency Management Agency." This was followed by a brief silence of about 3 seconds. And then a male voice began reading the standard test script. "This is a test. This station has interrupted its regular programming at the request of the Federal Emergency Management Agency to participate in a test of the emergency broadcast system. This is only a test." The voice was calm, measured, professional. It had the flat mid-Atlantic broadcast quality that was common in that era. I did not recognize it as belonging to any specific WCLV personality, but it would not have been unusual for a staff announcer or engineer to read the script. The delivery was unremarkable. Then there was a pause. This was also normal. In the standard EBS test format, there is a pause after the initial announcement during which affiliated stations would insert their local identification. This pause typically lasted 5 to 10 seconds. On this tape, the pause lasted 14 seconds. I noted this as slightly long, but within a range I would consider insignificant. During the pause, the screen showed a static card with the WCLV logo and the station's frequency and call sign information. The audio was silent. And by silent, I mean genuinely silent, not the soft hiss of dead air that you typically hear on analog recordings, but a complete absence of signal, a null. I noticed this because I was watching the audio meters on my capture workstation, and they were reading absolute 0. On a U-matic playback, even blank tape produces a small amount of noise that registers on the meters. This was flat, not low, 0. I rewound and played the pause section again. The meters confirmed it. During the 14-second pause, the audio signal was mathematically absent. I am not using that word loosely. The digital capture registered a continuous stream of zero-value samples for the duration of the pause. This is not something that occurs naturally on analog tape. There is always noise, always. Even on a perfectly recorded, perfectly stored tape, there is a noise floor. What I was seeing was either a digital artifact of my capture system or something that had been done to the original recording intentionally. I checked my equipment. It was functioning normally. I played a section of a different U-matic tape, and the noise floor registered as expected. A low but visible fluctuation on the meters. I went back to the EBS tape and played the pause section a third time. 0. Perfect, absolute silence for 14 seconds. I flagged this in my notes and continued the playback. After the pause, the announcer's voice returned. "This concludes the test of the emergency broadcast system. Had this been an actual emergency, you would have been instructed to tune to one of the broadcast stations in your area for official information and instructions. This station now resumes its regular programming. Standard closing script." The voice was the same. Calm, professional, unhurried. The screen displayed the closing EBS card, then cut to black. I checked the time code. The total runtime at that point was 3 minutes and 41 seconds, but the tape was labeled as 8 minutes, 30 seconds. There were nearly 5 more minutes of content. I let it play. The black screen continued. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20. I watched the time code advance. At the 4-minute mark, still black, still silent, but now the silence had changed. The audio meters were no longer at 0. They had begun to register a signal. Extremely faint, well below what would be audible on a standard television set, but present. It was a low-frequency tone, steady, sitting at what my spectrum analyzer indicated was approximately 18.9 hertz. This is below the threshold of human hearing, which is generally considered to begin at 20 hertz. The tone was technically infrasonic. I could not hear it. I could only see it on the analyzer. It was present, consistent, and it had not been there during the first 3 minutes and 41 seconds of the recording. I want to be precise here because precision is what I am trying to hold on to. I did not feel anything unusual at this point. I was not frightened. I was not uneasy. I was interested in a technical sense, the way I would be interested in any unexpected signal characteristic on a tape I was assessing. I noted the frequency, noted the amplitude, and continued watching. At approximately 5 minutes and 15 seconds, the black screen changed. It did not cut to a new image. It shifted. The black became a very dark gray, so gradually that I did not register the change until it had already occurred. And I only became aware of it because I happened to glance at the waveform monitor, which showed a slight elevation in the luminance signal. I looked back at the screen. It was not black anymore. It was a dark, uniform gray, and within the gray there was texture. Not static, not grain. It was more like the visual equivalent of the silence I had observed earlier. A field that appeared empty but contained structure when you looked at it closely. I increased the brightness on my reference monitor. The texture resolved into something I can only describe as spatial. It looked like depth, like looking into a dark room through a window. There were no objects, no shapes, no identifiable features. Just an impression of three-dimensionality within what should have been a flat gray frame. The infrasonic tone was still present. The spectrum analyzer showed it had not changed in frequency or amplitude. At 5 minutes and 50 seconds, a second tone appeared on the analyzer. This one was higher, 19.4 hertz, still infrasonic, still inaudible. The two tones together produced a beat frequency of approximately 0.5 hertz, which would manifest as a slow, rhythmic oscillation in amplitude if the tones were audible. They were not, but I could see the oscillation on the meters, a gentle pulsing, like breathing. At 6 minutes and 10 seconds, the image on the screen changed again. The dark gray field was still present, still carrying that impression of depth, but now there was something else. In the lower third of the frame, a lighter shape had appeared. It was indistinct. I increased the brightness further and leaned closer to the monitor. The shape was rectangular, horizontal, and it appeared to be text. White or near white text on the dark gray background, but rendered at such low contrast that it was barely distinguishable from the surrounding field. I could not read it at the brightness level my monitor supported. I pulled the captured file into my editing software and applied a levels adjustment, stretching the contrast to make the faint elements more visible. The text became legible. It was a single line, centered in the lower third, in a sans serif typeface consistent with the character generator equipment used at broadcast facilities in the early 1980s. It read, "This signal contains active component. Monitor for compliance." I read it several times. It did not change. It was a static graphic element composited into the video signal at extremely low contrast under normal viewing conditions. On a standard cathode ray television set in 1983, adjusted to typical brightness and contrast, this text would have been completely invisible. It was embedded in the signal the way a watermark is embedded in paper. You would never see it unless you were looking for it, and there would be no reason to look for it. I did not know what active component meant in this context. I did not know what compliance was being monitored or by whom. I assumed it was a technical annotation, the kind of internal note that engineers sometimes embedded in test signals for calibration purposes. It was unusual to find one this far into a recording, and the language was odd, but it was not beyond the range of what I could explain to myself in that moment. I noted the text in my log and continued. At 7 minutes, the image changed a third time. The gray field darkened slightly, and the embedded text faded out. In its place, a new element appeared, also at very low contrast. This one was not text, it was a pattern. A geometric arrangement of thin white lines forming a grid. The grid was not regular. The lines were spaced at uneven intervals, and some of them were thicker than others, creating a pattern that looked almost like a street map or a circuit diagram. I could not identify it as any standard test pattern or calibration image. It was dense with information, but I could not parse what the information represented. The infrasonic tones were still present. The beat frequency was still pulsing at 0.5 Hz. The grid remained on screen for approximately 45 seconds. Then, at 7 minutes 45 seconds, the grid vanished. The screen returned to true black, and the audio signal dropped back to zero. The tape ran in this state for the remaining 45 seconds until it reached the 8:30 mark, at which point it ended with a brief burst of noise, the characteristic sound of the recording stopping, and then blue screen from the player. I stopped the capture. I sat back in my chair. I reviewed my notes. I had an EBS test recording that contained nearly 5 minutes of post-test content consisting of infrasonic tones, sub-visible text referring to an active component, and an unidentified geometric grid pattern. All of this material had been encoded at levels that would have been imperceptible to a normal viewer watching on a normal television, and the tape had been permanently restricted by the station's program director with a handwritten order in red ink. I want to emphasize that I was still operating within a rational framework at this point. My working hypothesis was that the tape contained some kind of embedded test signal, possibly a Nielsen compliance marker, possibly a technical watermark used by FEMA or the FCC to verify that affiliated stations were properly relaying EBS content. I was aware that various forms of signal encoding had been experimented with throughout the history of American broadcasting, from subliminal advertising tests in the 1950s to the audio watermarking systems used by ratings agencies. It was entirely plausible that this tape contained a legitimate, if unusual, piece of broadcast engineering that had been restricted for proprietary or regulatory reasons, rather than because of any inherent danger. I was not frightened, I was curious, and that curiosity is why I did what I did next, which was to play the tape again. The second viewing began identically. Color bars, 15 seconds, black, 2 seconds. EBS header card with attention tones, 22 seconds. Announcer reading the test script. All of this was the same. I confirmed it against the captured file from the first playback. The waveforms matched, the time codes matched, the video was frame identical. An analog tape will always produce the same output when played on the same machine. This is fundamental. There is no mechanism by which the content of a magnetic tape can change between playbacks. The oxide particles are fixed in their magnetic orientation by the recording head at the time of recording, and they remain in that orientation until they are either overwritten or degraded by environmental factors. A tape does not change. I say this because I need to be clear about what I know to be true, so that what I describe next can be measured against it. The 14-second pause came. I watched the audio meters. They read 0 as before. The WCLV station identification card was on screen. I waited. The pause ended and the closing announcement played. Same voice, same script, same delivery. The screen cut to black. The time code read 3:41, same as before. The black screen continued. I waited for the infrasonic tones to appear on the spectrum analyzer. They did not appear at the same time. On the first playback, the tones had begun at approximately the 4-minute mark. On the second playback, I watched the analyzer through the 4-minute mark and saw nothing. The audio meters remained at 0. The screen remained black. At 4 minutes and 20 seconds, still nothing. At 4 minutes and 30 seconds, still nothing. I began to wonder if the signal levels were different on this pass, if the tape was producing slightly weaker output due to repeated playback, which can happen with older media. I increased the gain on my audio capture chain to compensate. At 4 minutes and 45 seconds, the infrasonic tones appeared. They had begun 45 seconds later than on the first playback. I checked the frequency. The first tone was sitting at 18.9 hertz, same as before. But the second tone was not at 19.4 hertz. It was at 19.1 hertz. This changed the beat frequency from 0.5 hertz to 0.2 hertz, a slower oscillation. I checked this 3 times against the spectrum analyzer. I was not misreading it. The tones were present, but one of them had shifted by 0.3 hertz between playbacks. This should not happen. This cannot happen with a fixed analog recording. The playback speed of the JVC CR8250U is crystal locked. There is no drift. There is no variability. A tone recorded at 19.4 hertz will play back at 19.4 hertz every single time, barring equipment malfunction, and my equipment was not malfunctioning. I had verified it between playbacks. The first tone was still at 18.9 hertz, exactly where it had been. Only the second tone had moved, and it had not moved in a direction consistent with speed variation, because speed variation would have affected both tones proportionally. This was a selective change in one element of the signal. I did not have an explanation for this. I still do not. I noted it, flagged it, and continued watching. The dark gray field appeared with its impression of depth. The timing was different this time. It came in at approximately 5 minutes and 40 seconds, roughly 25 seconds later than on the first playback. But the visual quality was the same, that unsettling sense of spatial depth within a flat image. I applied the same brightness increase and waited for the embedded text. The text appeared. It was in the same position, lower third, same typeface, same low contrast, but it was not the same text. On the first playback, it had read, "This signal contains active component. Monitor for compliance." On the second playback, it read, "This signal contains active component. Viewer responsive. Calibrating." I pulled the live capture into my editing software and enhanced the contrast to be sure. Viewer responsive. Calibrating. Those were the words. They had not been on the tape during the first playback. I had the captured file from the first playback, and I compared them side by side. The character spacing was identical. The typeface was identical. The vertical position was identical. But the content of the text was different. I need to say this very clearly. I compared the 2 captured files, the digital copies I had made from the tape's output. File 1 from the first playback showed one text string. File 2 from the second playback showed a different text string. Both files were captured from the same tape on the same machine within an hour of each other. The tape had not been removed from the player between viewings. No one else had touched it. No one else was in the room. No one else was in the building. Diane had left at 5 o'clock and it was now after 7. I was alone. I played the tape a third time. The standard EBS content at the beginning was identical to both previous viewings. The 14-second pause was the same. The closing announcement was the same. After the 3:41 mark, the screen went to black, and I waited. This time, the infrasonic tones began at 5 minutes and 12 seconds, even later than the second playback. The first tone was at 18.9 hertz. The second tone was at 18.95 hertz. The beat frequency was now 0.05 hertz, so slow that the oscillation on the meters was barely perceptible, just a faint undulation every 20 seconds. The tones were converging. With each playback, the second tone was moving closer to the first. The gray field appeared at 6 minutes and 8 seconds. The depth effect was more pronounced. Or perhaps I was more sensitive to it now, more attuned to what I was looking at. The texture within the gray was denser, finer grained, and the impression of 3-dimensional space was stronger. I felt as though I were looking through the monitor into a room that existed behind the glass. This was, of course, an illusion produced by the particular luminance values and their spatial distribution. I knew that, but the knowledge did not diminish the impression. The text appeared. I had already adjusted my brightness and contrast to make it visible without post-processing. This time it read, This signal contains active component viewer responsive. Integration in progress. I stopped the tape. I did not stop it out of fear. I stopped it because the word integration triggered a specific professional concern. In broadcast engineering, integration refers to the process of combining multiple signals into a unified output. If this tape contained some kind of signal that was designed to integrate with something, and if the viewer responsive element meant what it appeared to mean, then I was potentially looking at a recording that was designed to interact with its audience in a way that went beyond passive viewing. The implications of this were not supernatural. They were technical and potentially regulatory. I was thinking about subliminal messaging. I was thinking about the FCC's rules prohibiting the embedding of imperceptible signals intended to influence viewers. I was thinking about the fact that someone at WCLV had flagged this tape 40 years ago and ordered it pulled. I was not thinking about the fact that the tape had changed between playbacks. I was deliberately not thinking about that because I did not have a framework for thinking about it, and I had work to do. I ejected the tape and put it back in its case. I saved all 3 captured files to my workstation and made backup copies on an external drive. I wrote a detailed log entry describing what I had observed using precise technical language and timestamps. I locked the workstation and went home. It was 9:15 p.m. That night I slept poorly, but I attributed this to the fact that I had been staring at monitors in a dark room for 4 hours and had consumed too much coffee. I dreamed, but I do not remember the dreams in any specific way, only that they involved a sense of being in a large, dark space and being aware of a sound that I could not quite hear. When I woke up, I felt unrested but otherwise normal. The next day, March 16th, I arrived at the archive at 8 o'clock. Diane was already in her office. I told her I had reviewed the EBS tape and found some unusual content that I wanted to document more thoroughly. She asked me to write up a preliminary assessment and said she would look at it when she had time. I went to my workstation, opened the first captured file, the one from the first playback, and began preparing frame grabs and audio analysis screenshots for the write-up. The file was 8 minutes and 30 seconds long, as expected. I scrubbed to the 3:41 mark, the beginning of the post-test content. Black screen. I scrubbed forward, watching the timecode. At approximately 4 minutes, the infrasonic tone should have begun. I checked the spectrum analysis. They were there, but not at 18.9 Hz and 19.4 Hz. They were at 18.9 Hz and 19.0 Hz. The beat frequency in this file was now 0.1 Hz. I opened the log I'd written the previous night. I had recorded the frequencies from the first playback as 18.9 Hz and 19.4 Hz, with a beat frequency of 0.5 Hz. I had written this down. I had typed it into my workstation notes, but the digital file I had captured from the tape, saved to my hard drive and backed up, now showed different values. The second tone was at 19.0 Hz, not 19.4 Hz. The file had changed, or my notes were wrong, or my memory was wrong. I opened the backup copy on the external drive. Same values, 18.9 and 19.0. Both copies of the file showed the same thing, and both disagreed with my written notes. I pulled up the second captured file from the second playback. In my notes, I had recorded the second tone as 19.1 Hz. In the file, it was now 18.97 Hz, closer to the first tone than my notes indicated. The convergence I had observed in real time was also present in the files, but the specific values were different. The tones in the files were closer together than the tones I had measured during live playback, as if the convergence was continuing inside the files themselves. I opened the third captured file. In my notes, the second tone had been 18.95 Hz. In the file, it was 18.92 Hz. I sat at my desk and I looked at the numbers. The first tone was 18.9 Hz in all 3 files, unchanged. The second tone across the 3 files was 19.0, 18.97, and 18.92. It was decreasing. It was approaching 18.9. The files were not static. The captured, saved, backed up digital files were changing, and the change was consistent in direction with what I had observed during playback. The two tones were moving toward convergence, toward unity. But it was continuing after the capture, after the digitization, after the format transfer. This is when I first felt something that I will describe as discomfort, though that word is inadequate. It was not fear, it was the particular unease of encountering a phenomenon that violates a foundational assumption about how information works. A digital file is fixed. It is a sequence of numbers stored in a defined format on a physical medium. It does not change unless it is deliberately modified by an external process or corrupted by hardware failure. I checked the file modification timestamps. All three files showed the date and time of their original capture, March 15th. They had not been modified. Their checksums, however, I had not recorded checksums at the time of capture, which was an oversight I now regretted deeply. I made a decision. I was going to play the original tape again, this time with rigorous documentation. Checksums generated immediately after capture, screen recordings of the analysis tools, and a written log with timestamps. Whatever was happening, I was going to pin it down. I went to the shelf where I had placed the tape the previous night. The case was there, in the exact position I had left it. I opened it and removed the cassette. It looked the same. I loaded it into the JVC player. I started fresh capture software, verified my audio chain, and pressed play. Color bars, 15 seconds, black, 2 seconds. EBS header card, attention tones, all identical. I was watching the waveform monitor, the vector scope, the spectrum analyzer, and the video output simultaneously. The test announcement played. The 14-second pause came, and the audio meters dropped to 0. The station identification card displayed. The closing announcement played. The screen cut to black at 3:41. I waited. At 3:41, I started a stopwatch on my phone as an independent time reference. At 4 o'clock on the tape time code, 19 seconds on my stopwatch, the audio meters remained at 0. At 5 o'clock, 1 minute, 19 seconds on the stopwatch, still 0. At 5:30, still 0. The black screen had not changed. No gray field, no tones, no signal of any kind. The tape was producing clean black in absolute silence for the entire post-test section. I watched it all the way to the 8:30 mark. Nothing. The end of recording noise burst occurred as before, and the player showed blue screen. The entire post-test section, 4 minutes and 49 seconds of it, was empty. The tones, the gray field, the embedded text, the geometric grid, all of it was gone. The tape was now producing only the standard EBS test, 3 minutes and 41 seconds of normal content, followed by 4 minutes and 49 seconds of blank tape. I ejected the cassette and examined it. It was the same tape. The labels were the same. The red ink was the same. I loaded it again and played just the first minute to confirm. Color bars, EBS header, attention tones, identical, but the post-test content that I had observed and captured and documented over 3 viewings the previous night was no longer on the tape. I went back to my captured files. I opened the first one and scrubbed to the post-test section. It was still there. I could see the gray field, the faint luminance variation, the embedded text visible in the enhanced contrast view. The captured file still contained the anomalous content. The tape did not. The content existed in the copies, but not in the source. I generated MD5 checksums for all 3 files and recorded them in a new log along with the current time and date. I then opened each file in my audio editor and measured the infrasonic tones again. In file 1, the second tone was now at 18.93 Hz. In file 2, it was at 18.92 Hz. In file 3, it was at 18.91 Hz. They were still converging. The values had changed again since my measurement that morning. The intervals between the files were narrowing too. 18.93, 18.92, 18.91, separated by only 0.01 Hz rather than the larger gaps I had seen earlier. They were approaching 18.9 with decreasing increments, like a function approaching an asymptote. I went to check the text in the gray field sections. I enhanced the contrast on file 1. The text in the lower third now read, "This signal contains active component viewer responsive." Integration in progress. That was a text from file 3, not from file 1. On the first playback, the text had been, "This signal contains active component. Monitor for compliance." On the second playback, "Viewer responsive calibrating." On the third playback, "Viewer responsive. Integration in progress." Now all three files showed the same text. The third and final version, the earlier versions were gone. The files were not just changing in their audio characteristics. Their visual content was homogenizing. They were converging toward a single state, the most recent state, as if the act of sequential viewing had overwritten the earlier versions retroactively. I need to describe what I was feeling at this point, because I think it is relevant to what happened next. I was not panicking. I was not experiencing the kind of fear that makes you want to run or hide. What I was feeling was more like the sensation of standing on a surface that you trusted to be solid and feeling it give slightly under your weight. Not falling, just the awareness that the ground is less stable than you believed. My assumptions about how recorded media behaves were fundamental to my professional identity. I had built a career on the principle that a recording is a fixed artifact, that a tape records an event and preserves it unchanged, and that a digital capture preserves the tape's output unchanged. What I was observing violated both of these principles. Either my perception was unreliable, or the recordings were not behaving as fixed artifacts. Neither option was comfortable. I decided to bring Diane in. I needed a second observer. I needed someone else to look at the files and tell me what they saw, independently, without being influenced by my notes or my expectations. I went to her office and asked if she had a few minutes to look at something unusual. She did. I brought her to my workstation and played file 3 from the beginning without telling her anything about what I had observed. I asked her to watch and describe what she saw. She watched the EBS test without comment. It was familiar territory. When the screen went to black after the closing announcement, she said, "Is that it?" I asked her to keep watching. She did. The post-test section played. Black screen. I watched her face. At the point where the gray field should have begun. Around 6 minutes on this file. She showed no reaction. I glanced at the monitor. The screen was black. No gray field. No change in luminance. Nothing. I checked the spectrum analyzer. No infrasonic tones. The audio was at 0. The file was now producing the same output as the tape had on its fourth playback that morning. Standard EBS test followed by blank silence. The anomalous content that I had seen in the file just 30 minutes earlier, that I had enhanced and measured and logged, was gone. "Is there supposed to be something else?" Diane asked. I told her no, that I had just wanted a second opinion on the audio quality in the post-test section for my assessment report. She shrugged and went back to her office. I sat at my workstation and looked at the black screen. I checked the checksums. I compared the current MD5 hashes of the 3 files to the ones I had generated earlier that day. They were different. The files had changed. The checksums proved it. The original checksums, the ones I had recorded in my log, corresponded to files that contained infrasonic tones and embedded text, and a gray field with spatial depth. The current checksums corresponded to files that contained nothing but black silence. The content had been present, and now it was absent, and the only record of it having existed at all was in my handwritten notes in the checksum values I had logged. Everything else, the files, the tape, the captured data, had been overwritten or emptied or sanitized. By what process, I do not know. No process I am aware of can selectively alter the content of a digital file without updating its modification timestamp. But the timestamps were unchanged. Only the checksums revealed that anything had happened. I was alone with my notes, and I began to doubt them. This is the part that is hardest to write about, because it is the part where the thing I encountered began to interfere with my ability to trust myself. I had written extensive notes during and after my viewings of the tape. These notes described specific, measurable phenomena: frequencies, luminance values, text content, timing offsets. They were precise. They were the kind of notes I write every day in the course of my professional work, and I have never had reason to doubt them before. But now the notes described things that no longer existed in the source material, and there was no corroborating evidence that they had ever existed. If I showed my notes to someone, and then showed them the tape and the files, the notes would appear to be fiction. I would appear to be either lying or delusional. And here's the thought that settled into me like a cold weight. What if I was? What if the tape was always just a standard EBS test with blank leader, and I had hallucinated the rest? What if the infrasonic tones, the gray field, the embedded text, the changing content? What if all of that was a product of fatigue, caffeine, and too many hours in a dark room? I have no personal history of hallucination, no psychiatric diagnosis, no neurological condition. But absence of history is not proof of impossibility. People experience anomalous perceptions. It happens. I could not resolve this. I could not prove to anyone, including myself, that what I had observed was real because the evidence had erased itself. And I realized in that moment that this was the function of the tape's behavior. Not the tones, not the text, not the visual anomalies. The function was this. It showed you something, and then it removed the evidence that it had shown you anything, leaving you with nothing but your own testimony, which you could no longer trust. It did not need to frighten you. It did not need to threaten you. It simply needed to make you uncertain about your own perception. And it accomplished this, not through any exotic mechanism, but through the most elegant one possible. It changed the record. I went home that evening and told myself I was done with the tape. I had a job to do. The grant inventory needed to be completed. There were hundreds of other tapes to process, none of which had exhibited anything unusual. I would log WCLV-IB-0713 as a standard EBS compliance recording with no significant content and move on. This was the rational decision. This was what I told myself I would do. But that night I opened my laptop and searched for information about EBS test procedures in 1983. I found FCC archived documents describing the standard test format, which matched what I had seen on the tape's first 3 minutes and 41 seconds. I searched for FEMA Region 3 broadcast directives from November 1983. I found nothing specific to the date of the tape, November 4th, 1983, but I found general references to the region's EBS coordination procedures. I searched for any documented cases of embedded signals or subliminal content in EBS tests. I found nothing. I searched for Gerald Stassen and found only the obituary Diane had located, plus a few entries in the County Historical Society's records indicating that he had been involved in local broadcasting for most of his career. Then I searched for Broadcast Authorization 11-83-0041, the reference number from the tape's archive label. This search returned no results at all. Not no relevant results. No results. The search engine did not find the string anywhere on the internet. This was odd because FCC and FEMA authorization numbers from that era are typically referenced in compliance records that have been digitized as part of various government archive projects. A legitimate broadcast authorization should have left some trace in the regulatory record. Its complete absence suggested either that the number was internal to WCLV and not a real federal reference, or that whatever record it pointed to had been removed. I expanded my search. I looked for any references to WCLV Channel 7 in connection with unusual broadcasts, FCC violations, or signal anomalies. I found a brief mention in a 1984 issue of Broadcasting magazine, which I accessed through a university library's digital archive. The mention was in a column about FCC enforcement actions and read, in its entirety, WCLV TV Calvary, Maryland, Notice of Apparent Liability, $20,000, for violation of Section 73.1217, broadcast of information intended for the use of any foreign government or entity. Forfeiture paid, no further action. Section 73.1217 of the FCC's rules concerns the broadcasting of material that serves foreign interests. The fine was significant for a small public television station in 1984, and the timing. The notice was dated April 1984, 5 months after the November 1983 date on the tape. Suggested a possible connection, though the magazine entry did not mention the EBS test or any specific broadcast. I was not done. I tried to find the full text of the FCC's Notice of Apparent Liability for WCLV. Government enforcement records from that era are only partially digitized, and the specific document was not available online. but I did find a reference to it in an index of FCC enforcement actions maintained by a communications law firm's website. The index entry included a short description. WCLVTV Calvary, Maryland. NAL issued April 12, 84. Violation, unauthorized relay of non-domestic signal content embedded in EBS compliance test, originated November 4, 83. Signal content not consistent with FEMA authorized test parameters. Station response, inadvertent relay, content originated upstream, no intent to broadcast unauthorized material. Forfeiture, $20,000. Resolved. Non-domestic signal content embedded in an EBS compliance test, originated November 4, 1983. The same tape, the FCC had found something in this broadcast. Something that was not supposed to be there. Something that originated from outside the domestic broadcast chain, and had fined the station for airing it. And someone at the station, Gerald Stassen, had pulled the tape from the archive and marked it so that it would never be broadcast again. But here is what caught me, what kept me awake for the rest of that night. The FCC's action described the unauthorized content as having been originated upstream, meaning it did not originate at WCLV. It came from somewhere earlier in the relay chain. EBS tests in 1983 were distributed through a hierarchical system. FEMA originated the test, which was relayed through a network of key stations to affiliated stations across the country. WCLAV received its EBS tests from a relay station, rebroadcast them, and logged the event. The station had no role in creating the content of the test. It was a conduit. So whatever was on that tape, the infrasonic tones, the embedded text, the gray field, the geometric grid, it had not been created by WCLV. It had been transmitted to them through the official EBS relay system, originating from somewhere upstream of their position in the chain. Somewhere between FEMA Region 3 and WCLV's antenna, someone or something had injected a signal into an emergency broadcast test, and the FCC had identified it as non-domestic in origin. I am going to describe what happened over the following week as clearly as I can, though clarity is becoming more difficult. On March 17th, I returned to the archive and checked the 3 captured files again. Their content had not changed since the previous day. All 3 showed the standard EBS test followed by blank silence. But the checksums had changed again. They were different from the values I had recorded on March 16th, even though the observable content appeared identical. Something in the files was still shifting at a level below what my playback software could resolve. The changes were in the data, but not in the audible or visible output. I ran a hex editor on the first file and compared sections of the binary data to what the file had contained the day before. I had not taken a hex dump previously, so I could not make a direct comparison, but I could see that the file's data was not what I would expect from a clean digital capture. There were irregularities in the binary, repeating patterns in the byte values that should not have been present in a capture of analog noise. Analog noise is random. These patterns were not random. They were structured, recurring, and they bore a distant resemblance to the kind of regular patterning you see in executable code or compressed data. I want to be careful here. I am not saying the file contained a program. I am not saying it was doing something. I am saying that the binary data of a file that should have contained nothing but the digital representation of a video signal also contains structured patterns that did not correspond to any video or audio content I could detect through normal playback. Something was in the file that was not visible or audible. Something with structure. Something that was changing. On March 18th, I came to the archive early and found that someone had accessed my workstation. The login log showed an access event at 3:47 a.m. My credentials had been used. I had not been in the building. No one had been in the building. The security system showed no entry events during the overnight hours. The access was local, meaning it appeared to have been initiated from the physical keyboard of my workstation in a locked room in an empty building at 3:47 in the morning. The session had lasted 11 minutes. During that time, according to the system log, the 3 captured files had been opened, played, and closed. That was all. No other actions. I changed my password. I reviewed the security footage from the hallway camera outside my workroom. The footage showed an empty hallway for the entire night. No one entered or exited. The door to my workroom remained closed. The access log and the security footage were mutually contradictory. One said the workstation had been used. The other said no one was there to use it. I could explain this as a software glitch, a false entry in the log generated by a timer event or a system error. I chose to explain it this way. The alternative was that something had accessed my workstation remotely using my local credentials, which should not have been possible on a machine with no network connection. My workstation is air-gapped. It is not connected to the internet. It is not connected to the archive's internal network. It is a standalone system used exclusively for media capture. There is no remote access capability. The only way to use it is to sit in front of it and type. I began to feel that I was constructing explanations the way you build a wall, placing each rational brick carefully, knowing that what was on the other side was pressing against it. On March 19th, I examined the tape one more time. I played it through from beginning to end. Standard EBS test, then blank silence, same as the fourth playback. Nothing unusual. I was about to eject it when I noticed something on the waveform monitor that I had not seen before. During the closing announcement, the standard script, the same voice, the same words I had heard on every playback. There was an anomaly in the waveform. Specifically, the amplitude envelope of the announcer's voice was not smooth. It contained a very subtle, very regular modulation, a pattern of slight increases and decreases in volume that was too consistent to be natural speech variation. I zoomed in on the waveform display. The modulation had a frequency of approximately 0.5 hertz, the same frequency as the original beat frequency I had observed between the two infrasonic tones on the first playback. The tones were gone, the text was gone, the gray field was gone, but the 0.5 hertz rhythm was still there, embedded in the announcer's voice, in the standard EBS test content that had been present on the tape from the beginning. It was not in the post-test section. It was in the test itself. It had been there all along, from the first playback, woven into the audio at a level so subtle that it would be inaudible to any listener, but detectable on a waveform display if you knew to look for it. Or had it been there all along? Or had it migrated from the post-test section into the main content, the way the text and the captured files had homogenized across the three versions? Was the tape redistributing its anomalous content, moving it from the sections I had examined and flagged into sections I had assumed were normal? Was it hiding in the parts I had already accepted as safe? I could not verify this because I had not analyzed the announcer's voice at this level of detail on previous playbacks. I had no baseline for comparison. The absence of prior data meant that I could not determine whether the modulation was original or new. This is the nature of the problem. Every time I discover an anomaly and document it, the anomaly becomes the baseline for the next observation. I cannot step outside the sequence of viewings and establish an independent reference point. Each viewing changes my knowledge, and each change in my knowledge changes what I look for, and what I look for changes what I find. I am aware that this sounds like a description of confirmation bias. I am aware that a skeptical reader would say, "You are finding patterns because you are looking for patterns, and you are looking for patterns because you found patterns." And this is a closed loop that generates its own evidence. I understand this critique. I cannot refute it, but I also cannot reconcile it with the checksum data, which shows objective, measurable changes in files that should not be changing. The checksums are not a product of my perception. They are numbers generated by an algorithm. They changed, the files changed. My perception of the files may be unreliable, but the checksums are not perceptual. They are mathematical. Unless the checksums are wrong, unless the algorithm is producing different outputs for the same input, unless the instability extends to the tools I am using to detect the instability, I began to see the edges of an epistemological abyss, and I stepped back from them. On March 20th, I made a decision to pursue the historical record rather than continue analyzing the tape or the files. I drove to the Maryland State Archives in Annapolis, where physical copies of FCC enforcement records for Maryland broadcast stations are held in the Communications Regulation Collection. I spent 4 hours in the reading room working through boxes of documents from the 1983 to 1984 period. I found the Notice of Apparent Liability for WCLV. It was a 6-page document dated April 12, 1984, signed by the chief of the FCC's Field Operations Bureau. The document described the violation as follows. During the regularly scheduled EBS compliance test on November 4, 1983, WCLV-TV had rebroadcast a signal that contained non-standard embedded signal components not originating from any authorized domestic source. The components were described as subaudible tonal elements and sub-threshold visual elements inconsistent with FEMA-originated test parameters. The FCC's investigation had determined that the components were injected at an intermediate relay point, and that the content and structure of the embedded components are consistent with signal intelligence methodologies employed by foreign state actors. The document did not specify which foreign state. It did not describe the content in any further technical detail. It stated that the matter had been referred to appropriate federal agencies for further review and that WCLV's involvement was considered inadvertent. The station's response attached to the NAL was a 2-page letter from Gerald Stassen. His tone was careful, formal, and noticeably restrained. He confirmed that WCLV had received the EBS test signal through its normal relay chain and rebroadcast it without modification. He stated that the station had no capability to inject or alter signal content at the relay level. He noted that the offending tape had been identified, removed from service, and secured in permanent storage with appropriate restriction markings. He concluded by requesting that the fine be reduced in light of the station's lack of culpability. The request was denied. The fine was paid. There was one more document in the file, a single-page memorandum on Department of Defense letterhead dated June 7, 1984, addressed to the FCC's Field Operations Bureau. The memorandum was brief. It stated that the matter referenced in the WCLV-NAL had been reviewed by appropriate defense and intelligence agencies, and that no further regulatory action is recommended. It was signed by someone whose name I could not read. The signature was illegible, and no typed name appeared below it. The memorandum bore a classification marking in the upper right corner that had been redacted with a black rectangle, and a second marking at the bottom of the page that read, Distribution Limited. Handle via Talent Keyhole. Talent Keyhole is a handling caveat associated with signals intelligence and satellite-derived intelligence. Its presence on a memorandum about a public television station's EBS test recording was, to put it mildly, incongruous. It suggested that whatever had been found in the signal was treated at the highest levels of classified information handling. And it was attached to a document in an unrestricted public archive, sitting in a cardboard box in the Maryland State Archives, apparently overlooked when the file was compiled for public release. I photographed all 3 documents with my phone. I returned the box to the archivist and drove back to Calvary. That night, I sat in my kitchen and reread the FCC document on my phone. Signal intelligence methodologies employed by foreign state actors. An EBS test distributed through the Federal Emergency Broadcast Relay System had been used as a carrier for an embedded signal of foreign origin. The signal contains subaudible and subvisual components. It was broadcast on November 4, 1983, which meant it was transmitted into the homes of everyone watching WCLV at 10 o'clock that evening. Whatever the signal was designed to do, it did it. It reached its audience. The Do Not Air Again label came afterward. The tape was the record of something that had already happened. And I had played it 4 times. I thought about the embedded text I had seen. This signal contains active component, viewer responsive, integration in progress. Viewer responsive. The signal responded to being viewed. The text itself had changed across viewings, which meant the response was iterative. It progressed, it advanced through stages. Monitor for compliance, calibrating, integration in progress. 3 viewings, 3 stages. What was the 4th stage? I had played the tape 4 times, and on the 4th viewing, the anomalous content had disappeared. The signal had withdrawn. It had removed itself from the observable record, from the tape, from the files, from any medium that could be examined by a third party. It left only my notes and my memory, both of which could be dismissed as unreliable. The integration was complete. There was nothing left to observe because the process was finished. I am trying to write this next part without editorializing, but I need to convey the quality of the change I noticed in myself beginning around March 22nd. It was not dramatic. It was not like a switch being flipped, or a voice in my head, or any of the common metaphors for psychological alteration. It was more like a shift in the default focal distance of my attention. I began noticing patterns, not in the tape. I had stopped examining the tape, but in everything else. In the arrangement of objects on my desk, in the spacing of cars in a parking lot, in the rhythm of footsteps in the hallway above my workroom. I would look at an ordinary scene and perceive a regularity in it that I had not perceived before, a structure underlying the apparent randomness, like the structured patterns I had found in the hex data of the captured files. The world began to look encoded. I want to stress that I am not describing a mystical experience or a breakdown. I am describing a perceptual shift. My visual and auditory processing began to emphasize pattern and structure over content and meaning. When I listened to someone speak, I would notice the rhythmic envelope of their speech, the modulation pattern, before I processed the words. When I looked at a printed page, I would see the spatial distribution of ink before I read the text. This was subtle at first. It became less subtle. By March 25th, I was finding it difficult to read normally. My eyes would skip over the semantic content of text and fix on the structural elements. Letter spacing, line height, the frequency distribution of certain characters. I would stare at a paragraph and see it as a signal, a pattern of high and low values, a waveform. The meaning was still there, available to me if I focused on it deliberately, but my default processing had shifted away from meaning and toward structure. It was as if someone had adjusted the settings on my perceptual apparatus, tuning it away from the human-readable layer of reality and toward a lower layer, a substrate of pattern and frequency that exists beneath the surface of ordinary experience. I do not believe this is madness. I believe it is what the tape was designed to do. The phrase integration in progress described this process exactly. The signal was not meant to frighten. It was not meant to harm. It was meant to integrate, to merge with the viewer's perceptual system, to retune it, to shift the interpretive framework from content to structure, from meaning to signal. And it did this not through any exotic technology, but through a simple sequence of exposures. First, the infrasonic tones, establishing a rhythmic baseline, then the subvisible imagery, engaging the visual processing system below the threshold of conscious awareness, then the text, providing a cognitive anchor for the integration process. Each viewing advanced the sequence, each stage built on the previous one, and the final stage, the disappearance of the content, ensured that the process could not be interrupted, examined, or reversed, because there was no longer any artifact to study. The evidence was gone. The signal was in me. I went to see my doctor on March 28th. I described my symptoms as difficulty concentrating, altered visual perception, and insomnia without mentioning the tape. She ran standard blood work, checked my eyes, and asked about stress. Everything came back normal. She prescribed a low dose of hydroxyzine for sleep and told me to take a few days off work. I filled the prescription but did not take it because I was not certain that what I was experiencing was a problem. It was different. It was uncomfortable, but it was not disabling, and the patterns I was seeing were not hallucinations. They were real patterns. The structure I perceived in the world was really there. It had always been there. I was simply noticing it now. The spacing of objects in a room is a pattern. The rhythm of speech is a pattern. The distribution of light and shadow across a landscape is a pattern. These are measurable, objective features of reality that we normally ignore in favor of higher-order interpretations. I was no longer ignoring them. That is not madness. It is attention. But I was not the one who had chosen to pay this attention. That choice had been made for me by a signal embedded in an emergency broadcast test 43 years ago, and I had activated it by playing the tape. The text had warned me. It had told me exactly what it was doing. I had read the words and continued watching. On April 1st, Diane asked me why I had not been logging any tape processing for the past 2 weeks. I told her I had been focused on the grant inventory documentation. She accepted this. I did not tell her about the tape because there was nothing to show her. The tape was a standard EBS test. The files were blank silence. My notes were the only record, and my notes described things that no longer existed. I would have sounded insane. That evening, I went back to the FCC documents I had photographed at the state archives. I looked at the Department of Defense memorandum again. Talent keyhole. I knew from general reading that signals intelligence encompasses the interception and analysis of foreign communications and electronic emissions. If the embedded signal in the EBS test had been flagged as consistent with foreign SIGINT methodologies, that meant the defense and intelligence agencies had recognized it not as something unknown, but as something that fit a known pattern, a methodology they had encountered before. They knew what it was. They had seen this type of signal before, and their recommendation after review was no further regulatory action, not investigate further, not destroy the tape, not alert the public, no further action, as if the matter was settled, as if the appropriate response was to let it be. Why would you let a foreign signal embedded in your emergency broadcast system simply be? Unless you already knew about it. Unless the signal was not a hostile incursion, but a known component of the system. Unless the non-domestic origin was not a surprise, but a feature. I have no evidence for what I'm about to say, and I want to be clear about that. This is speculation based on the documents I found, the phenomena I observed, and the perceptual changes I have experienced. I do not present it as fact. I present it as the only coherent narrative I can construct from the available information. The emergency broadcast system was designed to be a one-to-many communication channel, a way for the government to reach every television and radio in the country simultaneously in the event of a national emergency. This is well documented. What is less well documented, because it is not acknowledged, is the possibility that the EBS was also designed to carry secondary signals. Signals that would not be perceived consciously by the audience, but that would interact with the human perceptual system at a subliminal level. The infrasonic tones, the sub-threshold visual elements, the structured patterns in the binary data. All of these are consistent with a system designed to affect the neurological processing of anyone exposed to it. Not to control them in the crude science fiction sense, but to adjust them, to calibrate them, to shift their perception in a specific direction. The non-domestic origin of the signal suggests that this system was not developed unilaterally. It involved foreign actors. The talent keyhole handling caveat suggests it was treated as intelligence-grade material. The DoD's recommendation of no further action suggests it was operating as intended. And the FCC's fine, $20,000, a pittance paid and forgotten, suggests that the regulatory apparatus treated the incident as a minor procedural irregularity rather than a genuine security breach. Gerald Stassen marked the tape because he understood or suspected what it contained. He could not destroy it. It was an official compliance recording, and destroying it would have created a regulatory gap. But he could remove it from any possibility of re-airing, and he could mark it clearly enough that anyone who found it would be warned. Do not air again was not a content advisory. It was not a note about technical problems or outdated material. It was the most urgent warning he could attach to a tape within the constraints of his authority. He could not explain what was on it. He could not discuss it because the matter had been referred to classified channels. He could only label it and hope that the label would be enough. It was not enough. I found it, I played it, and now I am different. I want to describe the current state of my perception as of today, April 14th, 2026. Because I believe it is important to document the progression. The pattern sensitivity I described earlier has intensified, but it has also stabilized, as if it has reached a target state and stopped advancing. I can still read, I can still function. I can still do my job, though I am slower than I was, because I process information differently now. When I look at a page of text, I see both the semantic content and the structural pattern simultaneously, in a kind of double vision. When I listen to speech, I hear both the words and the rhythmic envelope. When I look at any complex scene in a crowd, a landscape, a city street, I see two layers, the surface layer of objects and events, and the underlying layer of structural relationships and frequency patterns. The second layer is not random, it is coherent. It has a consistency that suggests it is not a product of my altered perception, but a genuine feature of reality that my altered perception now allows me to detect. I see the same kinds of patterns everywhere, the same basic structural motifs, ratios, periodicities, nested self-similarities that I first encountered in the hex data of the captured files. It is as if the signal on the tape was not introducing something new into my perception, but unlocking the ability to perceive something that was already present, something in the structure of the world itself. I do not know what to do with this. I do not know if it will continue to change. I do not know if it is reversible. I do not know if the 1983 broadcast reached enough viewers to produce a statistically significant effect, or if the effect was limited to those who viewed the tape in its original unbroadcast form, at close range with the kind of focused attention that I gave it. I do not know how many other tapes exist. The FCC document said the signal was injected at an intermediate relay point, which means it would have been present in the test signal received by every station downstream of that point. How many stations in FEMA Region 3 received and recorded that test? How many of those tapes are sitting in archives, in storage rooms, in boxes in basements, waiting for someone to find them and play them and read the label and decide, as I did, that curiosity is more important than a warning written in red ink? There is one more thing. On April 10th, 4 days ago, I was sitting at my workstation during my lunch break, eating a sandwich and not doing anything in particular, when I heard a sound. It was faint, at the very edge of audibility, and it was coming from the JVC U-matic player. The player was powered on, but not in playback mode. No tape was loaded, the transport was empty, but the player was producing a sound, a low, steady hum, so quiet that I could only hear it in the silence of my workroom. I leaned closer to the machine and listened. It was a tone. Two tones, actually, very close together in frequency, producing a slow beat that pulsed approximately once every 2 seconds. I recognized the rhythm. It was the beat frequency I had observed on the first playback of the tape, 0.5 hertz. I turned off the player. The sound stopped. I unplugged the player from the wall. I waited 30 seconds and plugged it back in. I did not turn it on. The sound was there, faint but present, emanating from the machine's speaker output, even though the power was off and the transport was empty. A beat frequency of 0.5 hertz, produced by two tones that I could not measure because my analyzer was not connected to the player's output. I sat and listened to it for a long time. It did not stop. Eventually, I unplugged the player again and left it unplugged. When I came back after lunch, I plugged it in and listened. The sound was gone. I have not heard it since. But I do not know whether it stopped or whether I stopped being able to hear it, because the two possibilities are, from my current epistemic position, indistinguishable. I have tried to be thorough. I have tried to be precise. I have tried to present what I observed in a way that separates measurement from interpretation and fact from speculation. I do not know if I have succeeded. I do not know if the perceptual changes I have described are impairing my ability to document them accurately. I do not know if the narrative I have constructed is the correct one or merely the most coherent one available to a mind that has been altered by the thing it is trying to describe. What I know is this: the tape was real. The label was real. The FCC documents are real and can be found in the Maryland State Archives by anyone who cares to look. The signal was embedded in an official emergency broadcast test in 1983 and was transmitted to an unknown number of homes in the FEMA Region 3 coverage area. The signal was identified by the federal government as non-domestic in origin and consistent with foreign intelligence methodologies. The matter was reviewed by defense and intelligence agencies, and no further action was recommended. The tape was restricted by the station's program director with the strongest warning available to him. And 43 years later, a preservation technician in a basement archive played it 4 times and is now writing this document because he perceives the world differently than he did a month ago and does not know whether the difference is in his mind or in the world. I will add this tape to the grant inventory. I will list it as WCLV-IV-0713 EBS Compliance Relay, November 4th, 1983, 8:30, condition good. I will not note the restriction markings because the grant application does not have a field for that. I will not mention the anomalous content because there is no anomalous content to mention. the tape, as of its last playback, contains nothing but a standard EBS test and blank leader. I will not discuss my experience with Diane or with anyone else at the archive, because there is nothing I can show them that would support what I am saying. The tape will go back on the shelf. It will sit in the cage with the other tapes from 1983, and it will be a tape, and that is all it will be unless someone plays it again. I do not know what stage comes after integration. The text on the tape listed 3 stages: compliance monitoring, calibration, and integration. These were the stages I observed across 3 viewings. On the 4th viewing, the content was gone. This implies that the 4th stage is not a stage at all. It is completion. But completion of what? What was I being integrated into? What system was the signal a component of? What is the function of a person whose perception has been retuned to see structure instead of surface, pattern instead of meaning, signal instead of noise? I don't know. But I will tell you something I have noticed since the change, something I have been reluctant to include in this document because it crosses the line from observation into something I cannot categorize. Since late March, I have been able to hear the 0.5 Hz beat frequency in other things. Not in the tape player, in other things, in the hum of the HVAC system, in the rhythm of traffic outside my apartment window, in the cadence of Diane's voice when she speaks to me about the grant application, in the pulse of the fluorescent lights in the archive hallway. Everywhere I listen, if I listen carefully enough, the frequency is there. The slow, steady oscillation, once every 2 seconds, present in the background of every sound, underlying every pattern, woven into the structure of ordinary experience, like a carrier wave beneath the static. It was always there. The tape did not put it there. The tape taught me to hear it, and now I cannot stop. I placed this document in my personal file on April 14th, 2026. I do not expect anyone to find it. I do not expect it to matter if they do. But I am a preservation technician, and preservation is what I do. I preserve things, even things that should not have been accessed, even things that change when you look at them, even things that continue. This signal contains active component, viewer responsive, integration complete. This is not a warning. It is a record. And if you have read this far, it is too late to treat it as anything else.